Hi, everyone. Wait a few moments while my students come on in to the virtual classroom. Talking about the Wizard of Oz, wonderful Wizard of Oz, talking about the MGM movie, which is not the wonderful Wizard of Oz, it's just the Wizard of Oz. And we're talking about Wicked, both as a Broadway musical, but also as the novel that it was originally based on, and then The Wiz as well. So different versions of the Wizard of Oz. And we're looking at all of these through this book. The Wizard of Oz is American Myth, a critical study of 6 versions of the story by Alissa, which has been our textbook for the last half of the course. Hi, Kit. Students are filing in and saying hello. So, what I've been doing the last few weeks in the course is just, this is very bright. Try that. Is that better? Yeah, it's better. It's a more even spread of light on my face. I've been adjusting lighting today. I feel like I'm shooting movies. I can't find a good lighting guy to work all my lighting stuff out. So this morning I was adjusting light back there so it wasn't glaring off everything. But I've been dressing the set, as you can see, putting in subject relevant backdrop. So it's not just a bunch of random books or all my D&D crap back there. Hello to all. AJ's there. Cairo's there. I feel like you guys wouldn't remember this because this is before your time. There used to be a show on Canadian TV called Romper Room. And on Romper Room, this woman would hold up this mirror that she could see through. She'd say it was a mirror, but she could see right through it. And of course, we were children and we were pre-internet children, so we believed everything she said. So, and she would say, I see so-and-so and so-and-so. And she would just say random names. But when she'd say your name, you'd always be like, she sees me, which was either reassuring or creepy, depending on how you felt about the host of Romper Room. But I see Bryn and Nisha and Catherine and Julie. So I see all these people have said hello. So yeah, today, my boyfriend is currently playing D&D via video chat in the other room. Yeah, this is the world we're living in, isn't it? Right? Everybody's doing stuff on video chat. I tried out something called Tabletopia over the weekend, where you play board games through an online, basically creates virtual spaces of those board games. Won't play the board game for you. You have to know the rules. So if you were going to play chess, it's not like, it knows how to move a bishop or a rook or what have you. You have to move those pieces, and you and your person, whoever you're playing with, you and your opponent need to be Scout's honor in that regard. So if your opponent's like, wait a second, you can't do that. You can't do that with a knight. The computer would just let you do it. But it was a neat experience because it allowed us to. We didn't get to play it with anyone across the internet. We were just trying it out. We actually owned the board game that we tried just to see what it was like. We were like, this would be really cool if if we were playing with people across the net. But yeah, we've been doing all sorts of. I think everybody's been doing this, right? We're doing all this virtual, staying in touch. So it's not so bad in a lot of ways, right? Cairo, when you say you definitely can't relate, is that because you absolutely weren't playing any role-playing games over the internet recently? You just can't relate. I know that was it looks like irony. I feel like there's an ironic voice there, but I'm just clarifying, what you were being ironic about. Today, we're looking at the Wizard of Oz in relation to your name would never come up on Romper Room. Okay, my student's name is Cairo. I think he's right. Yeah, my son has the same problem. He's a gunner. Like a Gunnar, and I think we're going to have to go to Germany or Sweden in his lifetime so that he can buy a magnet or a keychain or something like that with his name on it. Interesting names, though. So it's all good, man. Builds character or something. My middle name is Dieter, and it's spelled Dieter. It's German. It's a German name. And when I was a kid, I always felt like Dieter, and as an adult, I grew to love it and to have a great deal of pride in it. If you know old Saturday Night Live, you'll also know that it was a Mike Myers thing. This is Dieter. Welcome to Sprockets. So Home Sweet Home. Anybody who's watching this, by the way, if you're like, this guy's nuts, this is what my class is normally like, except I'm standing and there's more gesturing and usually more swearing. Wizard of Oz's American Myth, Chapter 5, Home Sweet Home, Alissa Berger, doing what Alissa Berger does, keeping each of her chapters very distinct. Each one is standalone. You could start reading Home Sweet Home without having read any of the other chapters in this book, and you would be on terra firma in terms of the concepts. She actually goes over, I don't know how many of you noticed this, but she reiterates things that she has already extensively talked about earlier in the book when she talks about female heroes, right? Women as heroes in the structure of Joseph Campbell's monomyth. She's already discussed this. This is something she's dealt with earlier, right? Page 129, as representations of gender in the Wizard of Oz narrative have become more and more performative, they have also deviated increasingly further. That's redundant, by the way. She could have said one or the other of those, but it's not fair for me to edit her like this, from the traditional formula of the hero's quest. And she's already talked about that earlier in the book. But what I like about this is that it's instructive. Even if we've read the entire book, it's nice to have that refresher in a way, to not have her go, as I said earlier, and then you're like, what did she say earlier? And you have to go and find that. And that's something that gets talked about in They Say, I Say, in regards to online discussion, but I actually think it's true for any writing that we do. And the phrase goes like this: don't make them scroll up. If you're going to make a reference to something that you already said, see if you can say it in brief summary in a way that gives the context to your reader so that they don't have to go fishing for that information. But she keeps us all firmly grounded as she goes into this discussion. Different types of home. She starts out, saying like there's these different possibilities for home. The first is just the idea of having a space that is distinct from the frontier. Right, the frontier is this space of lawlessness and beyond civilization, and home is this space that is safe, right? But that by the time Baum had written The Wizard of Oz in 1900, the frontier had vanished. There were no spaces of the unknown, as it were, or there were fewer, at least in America. There were of what would have been perceived as lawless spaces. Those were gone, and Berger talks about this. The myth of the frontier is particularly significant within American culture because of the romanticized westward movement that initially established the grit and perseverance which epitomized early national identity. And then she goes on to talk about that expansion. As civilization expanded to the Pacific coast, the frontier shrank and then became non-existent. Once conquered, there was a diminished sense of the adventure and danger that had characterized the earlier discourse of westward expansion. So where do you go when there are no frontiers? And Berger suggests that, this is how, what Baum does in creating Oz, created a new frontier. And this is a fascinating idea, because if we chart not only Baum and Oz, but fantasy literature in general and science fiction as well, we see the emergence in these genres of, it's Star Trek, right? The final frontier, these new frontiers. If you've got nowhere to go in your adventure stories anymore, if there are no spaces that have yet to be conquered, where do you go? Well, you either go to other worlds in space, or you go to other worlds through a tornado, or through a wardrobe door, or through a hobbit hole. And I think that there's a fairly compelling argument. I've seen a few theorists writing about fantasy and saying it was the disappearing of that frontier, that physical frontier, in all the places that the societies that were picking up science fiction, fantasy, and running with it were, the loss of that frontier required a fictional space where that frontier could still exist. I mean, because otherwise you were either writing in the past in Westerns or potentially colonialist, expansionist adventure stories like King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard, or you were creating entirely new worlds for those adventures, those types of adventures to be ported over to. And as she says on page 127, therefore the frontier lived on in the imagination of readers who could pick up a book and embark on an adventure in a strange and fantastical land anytime they chose. And this idea of the reader, the child reader of Oz, being able to pick up a book and travel, stuck with me as I read the rest of the chapter, and I'm gonna come back around. I'm gonna circle back around to that idea again. So, but then she goes on to position the frontier against the home. Right, the myth of the frontier was untenable without its opposite, the idealized safety and happiness of the home. And this is what I meant by it. Sort of stuck with me is that we have this space of adventure, the locality of the wildness of adventure of someplace beyond the civilized and safe. And then we have this space of the safe in the home. And I found myself constructing an argument alongside what Alissa Berger was doing in this chapter once she got to the discussion about where she started looking at the differences between The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and MGM's The Wizard of Oz. And this came in response to the discussion board where some of you were discussing these things. There's just a few voices who jumped in to talk about The Wizard of Oz. Cairo was saying, as Berger says in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and many other heroic narratives, home is the ultimate goal for Dorothy, and the MGM movie continues this trend. But then I got to thinking about how the MGM film, because it's a dream, that there's a way in which that changes this idea that Berger has just written about here, that the frontier lived on in the imagination of readers who could pick up a book and embark on an adventure in a strange and fantastical land. But if the land doesn't really exist, then I can't go back there. So in terms of return to a space, I got to thinking about why we never got a sequel to The Wizard of Oz. I mean, they did return to Oz, but that wasn't really a sequel to the MGM film in the sense that it's not a spiritual successor in any way. It's a very, very different movie. It takes place after The Wizard of Oz, but I don't think we can really call it a sequel. That MGM never made another Wizard of Oz movie, and there were lots of reasons for that. I mean, like, financially, it didn't do as well as people think it did initially, right? We know about that. We know about the way in which the TV show or the showings of the film on TV have given us this sense of inflated success for the film. But I got to thinking about how Baum making this frontier of Oz a real place in his narrative invited return in a way that the MGM film refuses, because you can't go back to Dorothy's dream world in many ways, especially in the way that Berger talks about it here, where there's this sort of refusal to hear the people that, when she comes back, that there's this shutting down of, oh, it's just a dream kind of thing. I don't know if I would say that. So as Zach's saying, a change from real to fantasy is what Hutchin calls transposition. Hutchin usually talks about moving from one mode to another as transposition, but I think that you could certainly say that is one of the differences between the two versions there, the two narratives. Do I think the MGM film sort of undermines the narrative capacity of the original story by making it a dream? Well, in the way that I just talked about, yeah, I do. If what you mean by narrative capacity, Parvin, is that the there's no ability to go back there. You can't go back to that Oz. That Oz only existed in Dorothy's dreams. And as I mentioned in class, the Broadway version of the MGM film puts this into this ambiguous space by having the red slippers be in Dorothy's room at the very, very end of the play. Everybody walks out, and it's just the set is still sitting there, and then the ruby slippers are revealed, and you get to go, oh, maybe she could go back to Oz. But as the MGM film does it, you can't, because it's not a place you could really go. So I do think that there is a reduction of the narrative space, of the way in which the setting was something that readers could return to. And I believe that she mentions something about this at some point with regard to the later books. Berger talks about this. Well, she notes that other people have recognized. She says, as Jack Snow comments in Who's Who in Oz, this is on page 130, it's interesting to note that the first word ever written in the very first Oz book was Dorothy. The last word of that book was again. And that is what young readers have said ever since those two words were written. We want to read about Dorothy again. But you might remember from earlier in the semester that we talked about how it might not be Dorothy as a character that they want to read about again so much as they want to go back to Oz. And Dorothy is not the through line for the later Oz books. There's a bunch of other characters. And the success of those books demonstrates that it wasn't about going back with Dorothy. It was just about going back. Oz, again, might be a way in which we could, riff on that. And then on the next page, 131, she says, the female power demonstrated by Dorothy. No, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I wanted to note. But I started thinking about those later books that, that was why they were produced, is because readers were saying, we want to go back to Oz again. And in the case of Bound's approach, they could go and adventure in that frontier one more time. And so I'm a little dubious about some of the conclusions that Berger comes to about Dorothy going home in Baum. I think that there's a sense of consolation for a child to get to come home from this really cool place. Like, you want to go and you want to adventure, but you also want to come home and have a nap. You want to come home and have a sleep. You want to come home to where it's safe, but then you want to be able to go back out again and enjoy the adventure. Tolkien's The Hobbit is built on that structure. It's adventure, adventure, consolation, adventure, adventure, consolation. They keep coming to places where they can rest. So they hit Rivendell and they get to rest. And then they move on and they get to Beorn's house and they get to rest. And Fellowship of the Ring is built on that structure as well. Leave the Shire and go to Brandywine Hall and you get to rest. And that's a common element in children's fiction. And here we have it with the very structure of each of the Baum Oz books, where, well, the first one at any rate, where she leaves home and then she wants to get home, but I don't think it has that same thematic resonance as it does in the MGM film. And as I say, and as I think Berger is arguing here, and as we talked about earlier in the course, the great attraction of what Baum did was to construct a world that people would want to return to. And that's why we have as many iterations of the Oz narrative as I think we do. And I think the reason that we don't get more adaptations of the other Oz stories is simply because of the ubiquity of MGM's Wizard of Oz as the Oz story. I have to imagine, like, what would it be like today if you could have the same level of success that Oz enjoyed in the first half of the 20th century? What if you had that same level of success for Oz at the beginning of the 21st? Like, what if, this is a weird little bit of speculation, but what if Baum was like J.K. Rowling and that the first Oz book was published, say, in 2000? Well, somebody would have jumped on that for a film franchise. They absolutely would have. And if it had enjoyed the same level of publishing success that it had in the first half of the century, I think we'd have seen adaptations of those later books in a way that we never have. They just keep going back to that initial story. So frontier, home, and then she also talks about home as a domestic space, right? The notion of home refers to much more than a spatially fixed. So rather than talking about space, talking about this domestic concept, house and family, right? It's more than that. It's an institution, right? The family is this institution in America. And she gets into a discussion of gender once again in regards to the idea of female heroes returning to home, very different than male heroes returning home, in that there's this expectation that they will go back to the domestic space that they left in the first place. As she said, can be read as indicative not only of the role of women within the sphere of domesticity, but also of the larger sociocultural milieu inspired in each retelling. The domestic space of the home, this is on page 128, is invariably more confining for the female hero than for the male hero. Therefore, while the male hero often returns to a new position of power and respect, the female hero is rarely afforded the same privilege. Seeing where you guys have gone with this. Cairo, the picaresque structure also makes for easy return to the text. Reread favorite chapters and such. I agree. And I said this a few times to people when I've been talking about what it's like to read The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I say it's like playing a video game. It's different levels. Each level there's a challenge to be defeated, and then you move on to the next level. And so, again, I wonder, Baum was really interested in new media. In fact, he sunk a lot of his money into it. And I've wondered, and this is crazy speculations, but this is what you get when, you lecture in the pandemic, I guess. If Baum were alive today, would he have sunk a bunch of his money into, maybe he would have written the first Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and then it would have been like, well, you know what we do with stories now, Mr. Baum? We turn them into these hypertexts where there's this, this ongoing conversation with all of these other ways to enter the narrative. That's the wrong term. It's not hypertext, but my brain isn't letting me know what it is. But it's where we've got multiple avenues of entry for the narrative, to the narrative. So you can get into the narrative via a video game, or you can get into it via a book tie-in, or you can get to it through it's intermedial. That's what it was. Intermedial narratives. That's not even quite the right one that I want. But if you're gonna get into a hot property intellectual, like some form of narrative right now. So when Harry Potter was huge, you could play the video games, be it the Lego ones or the more serious ones. You could read the books. You could join discussion forums. And I wonder about, what Baum would have done with that, given the picaresque nature of the original narrative. And it's why I'm just befuddled. Where the heck are the video games of The Wizard of Oz? There's no video games. And something that I was going to lecture on, and I'm not going to get a chance to now, but I really, really think you should all go and look into this because it's fascinating. So digression is this video game company that had done this really dark version of Alice in Wonderland wanted to do a version of The Wizard of Oz. And so they came up with this really cool storyline where the Scarecrow was like an undead creature, basically, and he's got these spikes growing out of his head because he's got all those nails. Right? It's very, very dark. It's not not a children's thing at all. It was. I think it's called O Zombie, instead of like I Zombie. O Zombie. So it's like Oz Zombie, right? And the Tin Woodman has an army of like steampunk robots, basically. The design work for it looks fantastic. So you can Google that and you'll find that there's a bunch of like design art that people have archived. It's sort of a bit of salvage there. McGee, that's what comes to mind, was the somebody McGee's Alice in Wonderland, and then they wanted to take a stab at doing this with the Wizard of Oz, but it never made it all the way to production. They had dreamed about it and they had some really cool concepts for it, but it never made it to production. Nisha said, I found an SNES, Super NES Wizard of Oz game, and all the music was 8-bit versions of the MGM film soundtrack. Incredible. I had no idea that existed. Was it any fun? Was it a good game? I find that like whenever you have a really established property, they sort of phone it in on the actual gameplay. Parvin, partially it's about the return and partially about this idea of a return to home being possible only through Dorothy stepping up and saving herself. I guess I wonder if the stakes are lowered. I certainly think that Berger thinks the stakes are lowered. I feel like the stakes are lowered. It doesn't mean that I don't still enjoy The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but it's far more quaint because all she has to do is wake up. She's not really in danger. I guess that's the thing that we know, is no matter how much danger Dorothy is in Oz, there's always a sense of comfort and safety if we know how it all turns out. I suppose the first time anybody watched it, back before everybody knew how it turned out, or many people knew how it turned out, people might have felt a certain sense of suspense and concern when Dorothy is being held by the Wicked Witch. And the Wicked Witch still retains threat through Margaret Hamilton's performance, even though we know it's a dream. It's the same, because it's a well-made film. It generates those things. Like my daughter asking, like, why do we always worry about Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible movies when we know he's not going to die, but you still go at certain points. But I do think that it lowers the stakes overall. And it reduces the value of Oz in some way, because really, you know, the goal is to get home. That's the theme of that. Berger talks a little bit about that in how there's this intensification of the value of the domestic space and the need for her to return to it. At the bottom of page 134, and I think this is what Cairo was referring to in the discussion board when he was talking about the very real concern people would have had in the 30s. In addition, this is the bottom of page 134. In addition, the Depression-era context of the MGM film's production and viewing further romanticized the longing for home. As Susan Mackie-Callis points out in The Hero and the Perennial Journey Home in American Film, the threat of losing home was especially resonant with 1930s film viewers. In fact, this fear was experientially grounded for 1930s audiences in the demise of the family farm, the loss of family fortunes, and the rampant rise of homelessness. Therefore, rather than reading Dorothy's journey through Oz as exclusively one of self-discovery, the socio-historical position of Dorothy and the family farm must be highlighted in order to historicize the significance of her longing for a home she believes may have been lost forever. But she's got to get back to that space, and that's something that Berger, I think, focuses on quite a bit, and says, you know, she's going to be returned to this domestic space and the domestic roles that she initially is trying to pull away from. Nisha filling us in on the game, and when you play, you switch between the character to use whatever they have. So, like the Tin Woodsman can use an axe, and the lion jumps better. Cool, I like that. This is the game that I want to see. I want to. And this is something we actually would have ended up discussing. So if you're like, oh wow, this is a weird digression, no, we would have talked about this in class. What my dream for a Wizard of Oz game is a mashup of those Sing games, those SingStar games, or any game that involved a microphone from the heyday of, you know, like when they first started doing that, you could get all these different games where you would sing along and they would rate your vocal ability. I want that, but I want it mixed with Final Fantasy. So you can play with 4 people and it's turn-based when there's a challenge. So it'd be like a mashup of Baum and the MGM film. And so when you're doing the Baum stuff, like you're fighting the Kaladas or whatever, you're trying to get across that bridge, trying to get the Scarecrow back, I don't know if you'd be able to do that one because that would suck for that player. But then you'd have this turn-based, like role-playing game, basically, video game role-playing game. And then there would be opportunities for the game to jump to being a sing the song from the from the MGM film. And I remember telling a group of my students this, is most of them were males, and they were like, this would suck. They told me this, nobody would ever buy that. So there's a lot of people who were like hardcore Call of Duty style gamers, and they were like, that would suck. And then I would get these emails from other people in the class, some of them male, a lot of females, saying, I think that game would rock. So thanks, AJ. I appreciate you telling me you think that would be pretty cool. People are like, nobody would ever buy that. And I'm like, I would buy that. I want to play that game. I want to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And then you could like buy an expansion for it, maybe where you could play it from the Wicked vantage point or something like that. I don't know. Or like there would be like if you could choose whether or not you want to play the MGM version or if you wanted to play the Wiz version. See, this is my dream. Anyway, back to the discussion at hand. So she talks about that difference between what Baum does with home, that there's an actual frontier to get to, is what I take away from that there's this there's a space that you can go and you can journey to, and then the MGM film goes, yeah, but you can't really journey to it. And as I say, I have to wonder if that's why we don't carry on in journeying through Oz, is because there's this impression that, well, there is no real place called Oz. That was just something Dorothy dreamed. But I think that that's changing now with the popularity of Wicked. That could change, right? Because now Oz is a place that people want to be in their imaginations again. Something that she says on page 137 resonated with me from a few of your first essays. A few of you talked about the color scheme and the architecture of Oz. Is really fascinating to watch the numbers drop while I was talking about my game idea. We went from 19 people to 12. Coincidence? I think not. Page 137, she talks about the architecture of the Wiz. Sorry, I'm just going to jump over to Parvin's comment here before I get back into that. I also think Oz has served its purpose as far as Dorothy is concerned. Need for return is non-existent. She gets another chapter, and I think it'd be cool to do that. But yeah, I agree. Like, let's move on to other characters. Oz is Oz was the attraction. To journey with Dorothy and her companions forever, we've done that. And so I'm interested in going to the other spaces in Oz, which is why I'm interested in this right here. This Marvel Comics series of adaptations of the Baum books done by, I'm going to forget his name, Eric Schanauer and Scotty Young. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful, well worth the money. And it takes Baum's stories, and I think we've got salvage going on here. This is what this is. This is salvage. Just a wee bit of appropriation, because the Scotty Young's vision of these characters is not Denslow, not MGM. It's 100% Scotty Young. Well, I don't want to say 100% because he's definitely working off of those earlier iterations. Page 137, though. However, in contrast to earlier versions of the Wizard of Oz story, the Wiz, so I'm going to change gears and move over to the Wiz. The Wiz also shows Dorothy journeying through a world that has fantastical echoes of her own. The Oz of the Wiz is a skewed version of the New York City that intimidates Dorothy in her real life. Now, if you do a deep dive into the inspiration for the Emerald City, you find with Baum, you find that it was all about this exhibition that took place at the end of the 19th century, and this beautiful white palace sort of structure that they had there, and that is very likely the inspiration for the Emerald City. So when Berger says, however, in contrast to earlier versions of the Wizard of Oz story, the Wiz also shows Dorothy journeying through a world that has fantastical echoes of her own. I have to push back against that and say, I think that every version of the Wizard of Oz up to the Wiz including the Wiz, did that. And it happens as well with the 1939 film. So some of you did some work on this, and you taught me a little bit. I sort of knew vaguely that the design for the Emerald City was Art Deco, but some of you had done a deep dive on that and looked into like how much of this, you know, was Art Deco and how much of this is very much contemporary with the architectural design of modern spaces in the late 1930s. So it looks folksy and antiquated and vintage to us because we're looking back at it, but to the original viewers of the film, that was contemporary. So when, you know, the Wiz shows Dorothy journeying through a world that has fantastical echoes of her own, this isn't a first, but Berger positions it in that way. But this is me saying, you know, this isn't me going like, again, let's throw Berger out. She doesn't know what she's talking about. This is me going, okay, so she's got a lot of really good stuff in here. Yeah, there's some stuff that we've disagreed with, and there's parts that we want to problematize, but I like the way that she charts how home changes over time, and we can study this through texts. We can study this through narratives. I made a note at one point in this chapter on page 128. She says, as the Wizard of Oz narrative has progressed over the past 100 years, the nature of the home itself has been complicated as well. What do we mean by home? What do we mean by family? Those ideas of the domestic sphere, those things have changed in terms of how we understand them and what they mean to us today. And there's a prof in the States named Michael Drought, and in his work on like just sort of intro English, he talks about the concepts, these two concepts in tandem of language changing and the text remaining the same. So language changes is evident in the way in which a word can change its value, like home, right? What does home mean in the 21st century versus what did it mean at the outset of the 20th in America? I mean, and it's very localized. It's not just the language changes over time, but that language and meaning can change according to the space in which you're using words. I like to use the term slush to illustrate this, because slush in Alberta is melting snow, hopefully in April. But in San Francisco, in the publishing world, slush refers to unsolicited manuscripts which have been pitched in the hopes of publication, but not by an agent. And so they call that the slush pile. So slush piles in Alberta are different from slush piles in California, I guess. So, you know, language changes. Language is evolving, but texts remain the same. And so each instance of the Oz story, as these narratives, these various narratives, are like artifacts of a moment in time. And we can't learn everything about a society, but we can learn some things about a society. We can learn, you know, about at least about how those the people who worked on it, you know, were making comments on their world. And so we get these artifacts that allow us to chart that. So there's value in that. There's value in the things that Berger says. However, she gives us an opportunity here, and I celebrate these moments. I get excited when I find a moment like this as somebody who does research. You should get excited about this sort of stuff because you're doing your research. And I'd said to some of you that there was going to be something in Home Sweet Home for those of you who are working on architecture, and this is one of the places where we've got that. We've got this reference, and there's a number of different ways you could approach this. You could say Berger says that that this is in contrast to earlier versions. However, or you can say this is something that she talks about from the 1970s Wiz movie, but I want to look at the way in which the Wiz Live what's the Wiz Live doing with that architecture, with those spaces that are potentially also fantastical echoes of Dorothy's home. Are they or are they not, right? And what do these changes bear out in taking a close read, I guess, of those particular narratives? We've talked a lot about home in The Wiz and how that's distinct from the earlier instances, because dream or not, Dorothy wants to get back to home as a space. Whereas the core idea of The Wiz is that home, as we get this quotation here from Glinda speaking to Dorothy, home is a place we all must find, child. It's not just a place where you eat or sleep. Home is knowing your mind, knowing your heart, knowing your courage. If we know ourselves, we're always home, anywhere. And that came into conversation with something that was said on the discussion boards about Wicked. Kit had said, this leads me to wonder, or sorry, I'll read the entire thing. I find it interesting that Maguire's Wicked has so many allusions to the idea of home and the process of the journey, yet all that is apparently lost, or at least largely minimized, and cites Berger on page 140 in the musical edition. So a Broadway edition, no home. And Berger makes that statement, right? She says, home becomes largely minimized in the Broadway version of Wicked by Schwartz and Holman. It's doubly interesting as well that though Wicked, the musical, is undeniably the more optimistic of the two adaptations, when I think about it in this light, it seems almost more sad. Elphaba might die in Maguire's Wicked, maybe, sure, but the Elphaba, the musical, is fated to a life on the run with Fiyero after faking her own death. This leads me to wonder, will there ever be a home for the Wicked Witch? And I think that the way that Elphaba is constructed in the Broadway musical echoes some of what's going on here with The Wiz. I don't think it's meant to be a direct intertext, but that there is a sort of conversation going on there where Elphaba knows who she is in the way that Dorothy is encouraged to know who she is by Glinda, so that we see the growth of the Wicked Witch into this as this replacement character. I really think we've got this shift from, like, Dorothy is the character that we want to identify with Wicked. We're identifying with her antagonist, and we don't care about Dorothy anymore. We really want to see what goes on with the Wicked Witch, but that the Wicked Witch is still engaged in some of that journeying to find home in the novel and in the Broadway musical. I have not read enough Plato to know Parvin. Parvin just said Glinda has definitely read some Plato, but I've not read enough Plato to know. So I will defer to Parvin in this, and everyone else can maybe add it to the discussion board. Let us know. But there is this loss of home as space, but not necessarily home as this concept that is movable, of belonging, that Elphaba certainly gets in the Broadway musical in a way which she doesn't. And again, this is something that Berger talks about at length, how Maguire's Elphaba is a nomad, right, moving from place to place well into her adulthood. And even once she gets the castle at Kiamo Ko, it's not really home. And when she goes home, she doesn't feel like she belongs. I don't think she really ever arrives at a point of belonging in the way that Elphaba in the Broadway musical belongs with Fiyero. And yes, she's absolutely going to be on the run, and she'll never have that space, but that she feels that she belongs with someone and belongs, as a friend to Glinda, I think is an evolution of that concept. And because we're not really doing a lot with Tin Man, I'm not going to worry about dealing with that. And if you were looking at the time, you're like, is he ever going to get to the monstrosity and the maternal images of motherhood? None of you are really working with the content in that part of the book. It's not. I'm not saying there's nothing in there that would be of use to anyone, but my read of it, like, there isn't a lot in there that's going to be really, really helpful for you, my students. So I'm not going to worry about that. Now, next week, you get one more of these. I'm gonna wrap up with chapter 6, Magic and Witchcraft. We'll have we won't have a discussion question for it, but we'll still get together and I'll riff. I'm going to hang around for a few minutes. I can't hang around for too long because I go back to back from this class to another class, but I can do this. I can sit here and stare at my camera for about 5 to 10 minutes if you have questions. I'm going to drink my water because I'm parched. I don't know how to interpret all those emojis. Look at it. Wow, old man, right? I don't know what those emoticons are. Which book is between Baum and the Grimmery? That's my annotated Wizard of Oz. Oh, I like that contribution. Thanks, Julie. It's very colorful. I mean, the rainbow alone is very Oz. Oh, I see what you've done there. The wheat is the scarecrow, yeah. And then you've got the tornado. And then you've got the, yep. These are all moments. Flying monkeys or wingless monkeys. So this is my annotated Wizard of Oz. I love this book. It's the same in certain places as the one that you have, but this is Baum and Denslow, and these are all the annotations. And this is like, talk about deep dives. So this is by Michael Patrick Hearn. And a lot of what he's got in here is from a book that he's worked on. He's worked on Oz a ton, but there's an earlier version of this. This is the Centennial Edition, and so it looks just on the pages when it's Baum and Denslow, it looks exactly like the facsimile version that you all have, but it's filled with annotations. And if you're wondering why I didn't assign this one, it's because when I read this for the first time, the intrusion of the annotations just kept slowing me down with the reading of that original text. And so I felt like, if I assign this, then you're all going to get a whole bunch of really great secondary source information, but you're not going to have that great experience of reading Baum as close to the original as we can. So, but if our journey this semester through Oz has piqued your interest in Oz, then you got to get that annotated version. It's fabulous. Cairo, when are you going to do a mini painting stream? Should I? I don't think I'm that good. Maybe there's guys who do a much better job of that than I do. I'm thinking about doing a podcast though, but I might just keep doing my YouTube channel. I want to talk about movies and books and adaptation and throw in a bunch of anecdotes in the mix. Yeah, no, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to stop painting. I love painting minis. You're welcome, Kit. But I don't know. Like I like showing the finished result, but I don't know if I want to film myself actually doing it. I get into this Zen space when I paint miniatures, and I wonder if I was thinking about making a video, I'd constantly be thinking about what I was saying rather than just getting very chill while I'm painting. It's one of the very few things that I can do anymore that never becomes about my job. I watch a movie, I read a book, sometimes song lyrics, and I start thinking about how I could teach whatever it is that I'm always analyzing narratives. There's no analysis when I paint my minis. So in as much as I appreciate the thought, it's cool. I don't think I'd do that. Oh, okay. Now there's a second. I second the mini painting stream. Maybe once. Maybe it was something really easy. Maybe it was something really huge. I got this for my birthday. Huh? It's like Treebeard. That's gonna be a ton of fun to paint. Of course you're against. Does anybody have any questions related to the course? If you don't, that's cool. I'm excited about the fact that you don't, because that says that you're in good shape, or that you would like to just email me a question. You're welcome, Cairo. No problem. I've been kind of hanging over my son's shoulder, watching what they're doing with like streaming classes to the kids. And initially the teachers were using Zoom or Google Meet or something like that, where you can have all these little windows of all the different people. And so you have like over 100 students in some cases, with all of their microphones involved, and the view keeps switching and stuff. And he came to me today and he said, my teacher has switched to YouTube. And I'm like, good, because it's the only way that you can control that. Okay, everyone wants to hand in their essays earlier. All right, I'll do my best. I've been grading for one of my other classes, so that's been taking up all my time. But I'm finishing that today, so I can do that tomorrow. I'll open the portal tomorrow. All right, nobody has any questions about the course. That's cool. Everyone have a good week. And just so you know, I'll send an email around about this as well. But if you looked at the course outline, in the course outline, it says that I do like it's diminishing returns for how much feedback I'm going to give you. So you're not going to get a ton of feedback on this last one. So weigh that when you're deciding when you want to hand it in. But if you're done it and you want to hand it in, get it handed in. All right. And I will echo what Cairo says. Stay safe, everyone.